On August 28, 1984, 18-year-old Elisabeth Fritzl disappeared from her home, leaving no signs of where she might have gone. Her parents reported her missing, but due to her rebellious nature and her tendency to run away, they believe she had run away to join a cult. Shortly after her disappearance, their suspicions were confirmed. Would they ever see their daughter again? This is the story of Elisabeth Fritzl. This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen. The case for this week involves several different things going on at one time. We're going to have a disappearance, cult involvement, babies left on doorsteps, murder, and then in the end it's going to be an unexpected reunion.
This week's case takes place in Amstetten, Lower Austria, in the country of Austria. So my understanding is that Amstetten is the city. Lower Austria is essentially what we would consider the state, and Austria is, of course, the country. There are traces of human settlement from the Stone Age and the Bronze Age in this area, so people have lived here for a long time. The population is about 23,000, and it was also the location of two subcamps of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Amstetten.
So the case is about a young lady named Elisabeth Fritzl, who was 18 years old. And she lived in the town of Amstetten that we were talking about, that's in central Austria, and she lived there with her family. She was the fourth of 7 children of Joseph and Rosemarie Fritzl. And her nickname was so cute, it was Liesel. As a young child, she was described as kind of shy, but as she began to get older, she became a little bit more difficult. She was described as very headstrong, she was stubborn, and a little bit rebellious. And she had strict parents who had some strong guidelines for her, but she had begun smoking and drinking and staying out all night. And like I said, this was a very conservative household, and these things were just not acceptable. Due to the contention with her parents because of her behavior and their conservative ways, at 16, she ran away from home for a few weeks, but she was eventually located and got returned back to her parents. She reportedly got as far as Vienna. She continually threatened to run away, though, after this. Her father even tried to help her and get her more settled, and he got her a job as a waitress. But on August 28, 1984, at the age of 18, Elisabeth Fritzl disappeared. And of course her parents were concerned and called the police to report her missing. But due to her previous behaviors and having run away, they were convinced that she had just run away again. And she had talked to her parents about possibly joining a religious cult. Well, she'd more spoken to her father about this than her mother. But he mentioned this to the police, and the police didn't really look again because they thought it was a runaway. And then around a month after she disappeared, they received a letter from her, and it was in her handwriting, and everybody said, yeah, this looks like an actual letter from Elisabeth, and it pretty much confirmed what they suspected. She said she was fine and she was making a new life for herself. But over the years, and Elisabeth not coming back, they received letters from Elisabeth, and they were postmarked from various places in Austria, so they didn't exactly know where she was or where she was mailing these from. But in 1992, now she disappeared in 1984. In 1992, Joseph and Rosemarie found a 9-month-old infant baby girl on their doorsteps with a note from Elisabeth. And it basically said that she couldn't care for the child anymore, and the child's name was Lisa. Elisabeth's parents had already had 5 girls and 2 boys of their own, so they decided, we're going to raise this child. In December of 1994, another baby appeared on their doorsteps with another note, and this baby's name was Monica, so they took in that child.
Wow.
In 1997, another baby and another note from Elisabeth. This baby's name was Alexander. Joseph and Rosemary decided, hey, we've got to do this the legal and the right way. So they went to their social services and they ended up adopting the oldest child and were basically like foster parents to the other children with the intentions of adopting them. But in the early morning hours of April 18th, 2008, Joseph found this sick young girl leaning against the outside wall of his home. And he just did not know what to think of it, so he called an ambulance because she was terribly ill. Well, there was a note in the girl's pocket, and it was from her mother, and it said her name is Kirsten. And I'm sure you know who the mother was.
I'm guessing Elizabeth. She's been busy.
It was Elizabeth. This girl was named Kirsten, and she was 19 years old. And she was pitiful looking. The ambulance brought her to the hospital, and she was in pretty bad health and even wound up going into a coma. The hospital staff described her as extremely pale, and she had a vitamin D deficiency. She was thin and basically just looked horrible. The hospital was stumped, and Joseph couldn't give them any more information because all they had was this small note from Elizabeth. So the hospital reached out to the media and wanted the mother to come forward to give them some more information about Kirsten so they could try to help make her better and figure out what was wrong. Well, eventually, 42-year-old Elizabeth came forward. When she arrived at the hospital, she had white hair, she was very pale, and she had this ash-colored skin like her daughter. She was extremely thin, and almost all of her teeth were rotten. She was in pretty bad shape herself, needless to say. So the police are looking at Elizabeth and saying, hey, we're going to charge you with the abuse of your daughter. And they began to question Elizabeth. And here's her story. She said, I have absolutely not mistreated or abused my daughter. I've been held captive and isolated along with my daughter. She said, in fact, she didn't just have Kirsten and the 3 children she brought to her parents. She had, in fact, given birth to 7 children. So the police are like, okay, who, what, when, where, why? And she didn't want to divulge all this information initially, but then she tells them where she was held captive, and it was 20 feet below the home of her parents.
Wow. So she never was missing at all, anyway, at all.
Exactly. So the home of her parents was located on a busy suburban street. What she said happened back in 1984. Her father had asked her to help install a cellar door in the new cellar they had built. So she goes down there to help him, and he either put an ether-soaked rag or chloroform rag, it depends on which version you hear, but a rag soaked with something over her mouth to subdue her. She said she awoke and she was chained to a bed in the cellar, and the chains were on her, but then they were secured to a metal post behind the bed. After 2 days of being chained to this bed, her father moved the chains to around her waist. And then she stayed like that for about 6 to 9 months. Of course, her time frame is just guessing because she's in a dark cellar and really has no way to tell. Mm-hmm. But about 6 or 9 months later, he completely removed the chains because they got in the way during sex. She said she was raped repeatedly from her second day of captivity until she was released in 2008. Now, this was 24 years.
All by her father.
By her father. She said she lived in this chamber and only saw her father and her children for the next 24 years. She didn't see sunlight. There were no windows in this cellar. And she said summer was the worst time because it was damp and hot. For the first 4 years of her captivity, she said she was alone in this chamber. During this time, she had miscarried at about 10 weeks pregnant. But then Kirsten arrived in 1988. Around a year later, Stefan arrived. December 1994, Monica. And then she had twins in 1997, Alexander and Michael. And remember, Alexander was living with her parents as their child. She said Michael died at 3 days old. And then in 2002 or 2003, depending on several different sources, whichever one you see, she gave birth to Felix. She said there was no medical assistance with the deliveries of any of her children. Joseph had given her a medical book from like the 1960s on childbirth. He gave her some disinfectant and some scissors.
So she handled the birth and everything herself.
She did it all. She said she tried to give her kids some kind of life in this dark, horrid cellar. And Joseph actually gave her a few books for her to educate them. And she would use the books along with the television down there for about 2 or 3 hours a day. Kirsten, Stefan, and Fritz only ever saw their mother and Joseph. And that was for the first 19, 18, and 5 years of their life, respectively. But they had never seen anybody but each other, their mother, and Joseph. The only other people they said that they saw were on TV and in books. Elisabeth said at times that her father would punish her by turning off all the power in this chamber and forcing her to stay in absolute darkness, as if it wasn't already dark enough. I mean, it was complete darkness. He told her that if she did not do as he said, that her treatment would become worse. So, I mean, she had to cooperate in order to keep from making it bad on herself. It was basically, she had to make this choice between being raped and getting a little bit of things or starving to death. She said before being put in this cellar dungeon chamber that Joseph began to rape her when she was 11 years old, which is why she initially tried to run away anyway, because her father was sexually abusing her. She said these rapes would happen in his car. They would go on walks in wooded areas and he would rape her. And even in this cellar that he built before she was put down there. She said he would bring into the chamber, he would bring in pornographic videos and would want to reenact the scenes, and particularly the ones that were violent. What helped them to escape was 19-year-old Kirsten became very sick, and Elisabeth begged Joseph to help or do something. And she finally convinced him to call an ambulance, which is amazing that he would do that after holding her captive for 24 years. And so when the media asked for the mother to come forward, she begged and pleaded with Joseph, and he eventually let her go to the hospital, but she was not to tell where she had been.
Okay, so just so that we can keep all these names straight, at the time Kirsten goes to the hospital, you kind of have this upstairs family, downstairs family thing going on. Upstairs you got Lisa, who's 16, Monica, who's 14, and Alexander, who's 12. And then downstairs, in the cellar, so to speak, you have Kirsten, who's 19, Stefan, who's 18, and Felix, who's 5. Alright, so a little bit about Joseph Fritzl. We already don't like the guy, but at the time of his arrest, he was 73 and his wife Rosemarie was 68. He's an electrical engineer by trade, and he and Rosemarie had had properties that they rented out to other people. He also had owned a lakeside pub and a campground. But as you might suspect, this was not his first sexually related offense. In 1967, he was convicted of the rape of a woman where he entered her home while she was sleeping and raped her. He was sentenced to 18 months. Now, I don't know how Austrian law is, but you would hope that someone would get more than 18 months for that. This didn't show up during the background check while they were trying to adopt and foster all these children, because Austrian law allowed these charges to be expunged after 15 years. So they didn't interfere with him adopting any of the children because he had had his record expunged.
So let's talk about the Fritzl home and the dynamic going on there, the structure and the dynamic between the family members. So the home was a 3-story townhouse, and he had constructed this cellar underneath the home and garden area, and he would go into the cellar every day around 9 a.m. or so and would draw blueprints for machines that he was selling. Like we said, he's an electrical engineer. And sometimes he would even stay in there overnight, but Rosemarie said he was a hard worker and he was dedicated to his job. So It didn't faze her if he stayed there overnight. In the cellar, and I'm going to put a map, a drawing of the map of this cellar and how the rooms were on our website, so you can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about. But
because it's going to need to be a pretty big cellar for all these people living down there.
Yeah. Well, it is and it isn't. It's big for a cellar, but it's still not all that big.
Right.
But down in the cellar, he had his workroom, and it was kind of a workroom and a tool room. And in this workroom, there was a shelf, and the shelf held cans of paints and other supplies. Behind the shelf was a 3-foot concrete and steel door that weighed 660 pounds. So this steel door is in his workroom. You have to move the shelf to open the door, and once you open the door, then you're into the chamber where Elisabeth and the kids were kept. The captive rooms, or the area where Elisabeth and the children were kept, I mean, obviously were very well hidden. And he had told Elisabeth and the children if they messed with the door, it would send an electric shock through them and kill them. So they didn't dare try that theory out to see if it would. And he also had told them if they tried to escape, he had it set up where a poisonous gas would automatically be released into this chamber and kill all of them. Not only could they not escape, I mean, there's only one door out, but they didn't dare try for fear that they would die. So after you enter into the chamber from the workroom, there was a 5-meter long hallway that led into like a kitchen and bath area for Elisabeth and the kids. And then off of that kitchen bath area, there were 2 bedrooms, and each of them had a bed in it. The total chamber area, or the living space for these people, was about 650 square feet, or 60 square meters. So in total, with the kitchen and the bath and the bedroom. So it's not very big. And the floor was kind of uneven and lumpy. And the tallest height in this cellar was about 5 foot 6 inches.
Ooh.
So we're talking about a small, cramped space.
I mean, some of them probably weren't even able to stand up all the way. I mean, a 19-year-old female or male could be over 5 foot 6.
Yeah, they could be, but I'm gonna guess. I mean, this is just my best guess. With the malnourishment and the lack of vitamin D, they probably didn't grow.
Right, didn't develop as a normal child would.
I don't know, because I couldn't find that information because I was interested to know that. But that is, I mean, that's just an educated guess there. So this cellar chamber area was not very well lit, and it was damp all the time. But also in the chamber, there was another room, and it was a room that he had soundproofed. And this is where he would rape and assault Elisabeth. So the kids would be put to bed or put in another room, and he would take her into this soundproof room and rape her and act out these violent pornographic things with her. And Rosemary said, you know, she had absolutely no idea. When Joseph told her Elisabeth had talked about joining a religious cult, and due to her having run away before, she just believed it. She accepted the letters that she was receiving from Elisabeth because it was lining up with what Joseph said, and she knew they were in Elisabeth's handwriting, so she was none the wiser. We also learned that at some point in the 90s, best estimates on all the research I did was somewhere around 1994, but that might not have been the exact year. He went on this tourist sex tour of Thailand for about 3 weeks. So they are in captivity at this time, and he leaves for 3 weeks with no fear that somebody's going to find them or they're going to escape or anything.
I wonder, you said Rosemary has no idea any of this is going on. I'm not so sure about that. I'm kind of skeptical of that. Now, she may not have known for certain that her daughter that she believes is missing is really being held captive 20 feet under her house. But there's no way he's doing it this frequently, going in and out of the room and all that without it appearing weird. The whole, I just work down there. Hell, he works so hard, and he works down there all hours of the night. There's no way that goes on for 20-something years without her getting a little suspicious about it.
I don't know. I mean, routine, and I don't know the full dynamic of what went on in the house, but obviously she's raising a bunch of kids that are her husband's children he fathered with his daughter. So the routine of him going down there just may have been their norm, and she really didn't know anything. And you know as well as I do, when you're living in a situation, you're completely blinded to some of the things that you would not be if you weren't living that or in a relationship with somebody.
Yeah, but so where did he tell her he was going? What did he tell her about the trip to Thailand? Surely he didn't tell her, hey, honey, I'll see you in 3 weeks. I'm headed on a sex tour of Thailand.
I don't know. He very well could have. She may have been accepting of the things he did, because I did on one site see a video of him on this tour in Thailand, and he's wearing bikini bottoms walking around. So I mean, she may have known. But while he's on this trip in Thailand, the way that they got food was that he had stored up food for them, and like I said, he wasn't worried they were going to escape or anybody was going to find them, because she'd already been there for 10 years or so, and he had no worries. The birth of the twins, Michael and Alexander, and remember, Alexander lived upstairs and Michael died at 3 days old. She said that Joseph burned the baby's body in the wood-burning stove that was there in the cellar. And Joseph later admitted that's exactly what he did. When the time came and he let Elisabeth go to the hospital to see Kirsten and to help her get better, he ended up bringing the 2 other children, Stefan and Felix, upstairs and told Rosemary that Elisabeth had returned home with her children.
And there's no way he expected that to last, because these 2 kids who haven't seen anybody other than on TV or their mother or him, they're immediately going to disclose this to Rosemary, right? He has to know that it's over at this point.
Probably, because if he were trying to keep a secret, I mean...
Well, he's let her go to the hospital and everything.
Yeah, I mean, these children, I mean, I guess he expected Rosemary to believe him because she had believed everything all along. He probably thought that it might start crumbling down, but she did believe him initially.
Okay, so obviously the police are going to want to talk to Joseph, and so they get him and they get a statement from him, and he starts off by denying that he enslaves them. He says that he imprisoned his daughter because she was a wayward child and he was trying to protect her, and that he had done her the favor of creating a place where he could keep her away from the world and its influences. Now,
I'm wondering if he told the police this hoping that they would buy it, because, I mean...
Sounds like a quick tour of the cellar and a statement from the daughter would make that go away, but... So he says he went to the cellar almost every day, and he brought books and toys for the kids and flowers and clothing for his daughter. He said he would watch TV with the children while Elisabeth cooked dinner, and they would all sit down and eat as a family.
This part that just makes me sick.
Yeah, I mean, and you got to wonder how much truth there is to that, really. Anyway, I would be interested in Elisabeth's take on that. Bet it wasn't your typical family dinner. He claimed that Rosemary knew nothing of Elisabeth and the other children. He was real adamant with the police that he was not an animal, and he thought constantly of freeing the captives. And he told the police that he knew the entire 24 years that what he was doing wasn't right. He said that he knew he must have been crazy, and that each week the situation got crazier. And he attributes this to kind of his background. He says he was raised by a mother who didn't love him, and that she would leave him alone for hours, and most of his childhood he spent in a state of anxiety. And he said that he was abused and left crying, but yet he had sexual fantasies about his mother as a result of this abuse. Now, he claims that he fixated on Elisabeth because she reminded him of his mother. And he started to develop this drive to have sex with her, and that drive continued to get stronger and stronger. He described it as an addiction. He told police that he had learned to withhold his feelings, and that violent sex gave him an outlet for those emotions. He told the police that the cellar belonged to him, that it was his kingdom to only which he had access. No one would dare enter or ask what he was doing.
Well, and that's like I said, I mean, it was his place. So Rosemary, him going there, that was their norm.
And he claims that he didn't need to use force for his captive family to obey him. They accepted that he was the head of the family and they would never have dared to attack him, which isn't all the way true, because we heard earlier where he told them that if they touched the door, they would get electrocuted or that gas would fill the room up and they would all die. So it's not like they were just real accepting of all this.
But the kids knew no other way of life. That was their norm for them.
Right.
So, I mean, they wouldn't know to attack him.
Right.
So there were some other people that were involved that I found I wanted to kind of go over. There was a friend of the family that had visited the home several times when Elisabeth was growing up, and he said he noticed they were a little bit more aggressive, or Joseph was a little bit more aggressive towards Elisabeth, and she got a slap for every small thing that she did. He said this didn't seem to take place with the other children, just more so with Elisabeth. We talked about them renting out properties, but they also rented out part of their home to tenants. And there was a tenant that lived on the first floor in the home for 12 years. And he was told if he ever went into the cellar, he would be evicted. He had no clue that he was living above Elisabeth and her children. He said he would hear noises coming from below. He was told it was from a gas heating system. And he just accepted that because it sounded logical to him.
So in addition to conducting an interview of Joseph, the police also launched an investigation, of course. And they went into the cellar and found that it was so confined that they had to work in short spurts of time because there was limited oxygen in there. But the cellar wasn't a secret. It's not like he built this without anyone knowing, because it had to be inspected by planning inspectors. He had it inspected in 1983 and he added additions to it from the original plan.
So he added this secret chamber on that wasn't part of the original plan.
Yes. And the police noted that the children were polite and that they could read and write. The youngest child was thrilled at the thought of actually seeing rain. So you can imagine these kids that have been essentially in a cellar basement for their entire lives. I mean, things like rain, they've never seen it. In fact, everything that they saw was amazing to them. The police started to develop theories, and they believe that he started planning this for Elisabeth when she was young, probably as early as 1978. They also believe that he allowed the three children to live upstairs because after Kirsten and Stefan was born, it was really crowded in the cellar. It was too late to pass Kirsten and Stefan off to his wife because, they could talk and had memories of their mother in the cellar, and they would have blown the story wide open, so they had to remain in captivity.
So that would explain why the others went up as babies.
Sure. And when the youngest came along, the upstairs was becoming full, so that presented another problem. The police also thought that it was possible that Joseph had been considering releasing the captives because Rosemary had received a letter from Elisabeth saying she wanted to come home, but it wasn't possible yet. You got to remember, at this time, he's starting to get old.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this thing is, in his mind, is probably running its course. And he realized that he couldn't keep doing it forever, that the system wasn't going to hold. And, if something happened to him health-wise, no one would be able to feed the people downstairs, or no one would know about them at all. And the police also speculated that it was possible he was just no longer sexually attracted to his daughter because she had aged a lot at this point. Psychiatrists said that Elisabeth was the only one of all of them to know that she was a victim. The others didn't really have any typical victim feelings because their lives were normal. That was their normal. I mean, so they didn't really feel like, which I guess it's horrible, but at the same time, it's good for them because they don't feel
victimized.
They said that Joseph had locked his daughter up because he had an overwhelming desire to exert power and control over another person, to dominate them. And those were rooted back to fantasies that he had as a young man, and those fantasies just grew and grew, and he continued to have them until he was finally able to do something about it and live out those fantasies. The police believe that Joseph chose Elisabeth because she was the most rebellious, and this would have appealed to his desire to exert power and control over a person. It is more gratifying if that person is strong and real stubborn.
So Joseph is brought to trial. During the trial, it's pointed out that his motivation was not to protect his daughter, but it was to have a sex slave, which I think we all kind of realize that at this point anyway. And what he was charged with was the murder of the baby Michael that died at 3 days old. They said due to him holding them in captivity and not seeking a medical attention or allowing any intervention, this child died, and the murder was on him. He was also charged with incest and sequestration, which is like in the U.S. it would be like false imprisonment. He was charged with grievous assault and 3,000 counts of rape.
Whew. And in a situation like this, you kind of wonder how they come up with that number.
Well, I think she said it was happening on average this many times in a week in 24 years. I mean, goodness gracious. Well, Joseph wound up pleading guilty to the incest, but he pled not guilty to the murder and enslavement. But once they showed the taped testimony of Elisabeth, which they didn't make her testify in open court, they taped it and then showed it. And once he saw that, he wound up changing his plea to guilty on all counts.
Good for him. I hope they have the death penalty.
In 2009, he was sentenced to life in prison in a psychiatric unit. And his attorney said Joseph would not appeal the charges because they feel like the punishment fits the crime. Joseph was getting so much harassment in jail and people hated him so much, he wound up changing his last name to Meyerhoff. And he is still having to be kept in a solitary unit because the other prisoners hate him so much. The Austrian media has said that he has had absolutely zero visits from any of his family, which...
No shock there.
Yeah, I mean that includes Rosemary. And he has said recently that he still hopes to be released one day.
Well, I hope that he's not released, ever.
I don't think there's a chance of that.
One of the unique things about this case is when you look at Elisabeth and the things that happened in the world during the 24 years that she was held captive. I mean, things that she just completely missed. The invention of cell phones and the internet happened while she was in captivity. The Berlin Wall came down. Princess Diana died in a car crash. The world coped with mad cow disease. The O.J. Simpson trial. Nelson Mandela was released. The Tiananmen Square incident. The money changed to the euro. And DNA became a way to convict criminals. And the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident happened. So all of these huge events in the world.
Well, I think she had some idea because he did allow her to have a television, but it's just thinking of 24 years and all the things that happen in a 24-year time span is, we can't fathom that and what it means. So here's a few final thoughts I want to leave you with. Elisabeth and her children were given new identities and moved to an undisclosed location in Austria. And even the Austrian media protects the location of the family, so nobody knows. They refer to it as Town X or Village X. I mean, people don't know, and people who do know are protecting them and won't release it, which is amazing.
Yeah, you'd probably never get that out of the U.S. media.
I did see in some reports that Rosemary and Elisabeth had reunited and were working on their relationship because Rosemary did not know, but she also had not been with her daughter for 24 years. The cellar where they were held captive, this chamber, this dungeon, this horrific place, it has now been filled in with concrete. So, and that just goes to show us we never know what's going on in somebody's home. You look at your home and you're like, oh, I have this good home life. But you just don't know. Nobody ever suspected that Joseph had his daughter living in captivity for this long because he was perceived as a good man and people liked him. And, his tenants and his wife and even his children that he fathered with his daughter that didn't know that he was actually their father. I mean, everybody thought he was this good person. And that goes right back to what I always say, trust no one. You never know. And like I said, this was going on in the home right below everyone who had no clue.
It's just interesting how things aren't always what they appear. You know, we deal with that a lot in law enforcement, and so we kind of take that and we accept that. We're used to that. If the general public knew what was going on in the houses of other members of their community, I think it would shock a lot of people.
Oh, I know for a fact it would.
Yeah.
So, as always, like I said, trust no one. If you see something, say something.
Well, and we hope you've enjoyed this week's episode. We'll see you next week.
Photos, links, and sources for this podcast can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.